Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Andres, this is an insightful place that you have created here. It's a unique community of scholars coming from different backgrounds, joined around the concept of platforms. So thank you very much for initiating this dialogue. This has been an enlightening experience. We come from different backgrounds, and it is platforms indeed that provide for an interesting conversation. As Kinga kindly introduced me, I work at the University of Lodz, and I work on international law and internet governance. International law boasts of being an independent legal framework. So we would look, thank you. So we would look at norms and principles at the global level. Brilliant, thank you very much for the slides. And we are trying to figure out how to use these for the global cyberspace. Nothing could be easier, right? Well, I'm going to argue that that's indeed the case. We have been talking about norms and principles in cyberspace for quite some time. So keeping in mind that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, I'm going to start with a brief recap of this academic conversation we have been having now for roughly a decade around norms and principles. When I talk to my students about the way we might want to regulate cyberspace, I start with this picture. Now, we do have quite a few students in the room. I will not quiz you on this, but do take a few moments and try to answer the question, what is wrong with this picture? What is missing? To those of you who speak a little bit of Dutch, or at least are good enough in German to figure it out, the city of Machinga in the Netherlands has a hint for you right there at the welcoming sign. It says here that Machinga, a small town in the Netherlands, is verkeersbordfree. I'm going to give you a few moments. Take a look. What is missing in that picture? It's road signs. Machinga is a small town in the Netherlands that decided to undergo an exciting social experiment. They took down all road signs. I tell this story to my students, and then I ask, how do you guys think that ended? And they know me a little bit. I wouldn't share this story if the number of casualties in the streets in Machinga had gone up rapidly. Quite to the contrary. The number of street incidents in Machinga went down by 30%. Okay, so if you take down road signs, the streets become safer. Scientists loved that, and they looked into it. Now, this example, I admit, unfortunately, is not mine. I didn't link it with cyberspace. This was done by Jonathan Zittrain in his book on the future of the internet and how to stop it, with a revealing title. He used Machinga to differentiate between norms and principles. Road signs are the norms. You stand there at a pedestrian crossing, you see a red light, and you wait for it to turn green. Once it turns green, you cross without looking left and right. That's a norm that tells you you have to stop at a red light and go when it's green. Principles work a little bit differently. We, as lawmakers, trust you to make the right choice. We know that when you will want to cross the street, you will look both ways. When people are given the responsibility, they tend to rise to the challenge. This is the secret to the number of street accidents in Machinga going down by 30%. Zittrain loved that example, and he said, okay, let's try that in cyberspace. And he went on to build this narrative around giving certain confidence to online communities for them to develop their own rules. He was not alone. A few years earlier, David Post published a series of articles that was focused on what he called that civic virtue. He argued that cyberspace is ill-suited to territorial legal regulation. Cyberspace is transboundary. These old concepts of national laws are ill-suited for cyberspace. We need to find something different. He argued that when we look at people online, we will be able to identify a basic set of principles, moral principles, if you will, by which they abide. He called this complex system of online morals, if you will, a civic virtue, and argued that we could build citizenship of the network based on those values. I love this idea. I'm an idealist at heart. If we can all join forces, work together, we will build a better world. And that's basically what Post was saying. He said, okay, if we internalize the values, if we all really care about cyberspace and being nice and good to each other, share the burden and share the benefits, we shall build a better world, right? Well, I'm in Budapest, and I'm coming from Poland. We tried it. It doesn't work, right? So this somewhat, I love that paper, somewhat socialist approach where we all join forces and merrily work together. Sorry, it's against human nature. I don't need to explain this in this wonderful hall that certainly remembers that lesson learned very hard by this part of the world. Okay, so we had better ideas. In 2009, Lessig and Benkler came up with this concept of a hybrid economy. Now, when I mention hybrid economy now in 2020 or 2021, students stand up and say, yeah, that's Uber. Uber has nothing to do with that concept of a hybrid economy. Let me elaborate, but this is just a side note. This is not about Uber. That's not what they had in mind back in 2009. I'm just using 2 points of reference here since they depart from the same ideology, if you will. In Remix, Lawrence Lessig went on to differentiate the commercial economy and the sharing economy. And he argued we have arrived at a new breaking point that he called the hybrid economy. Examples. Let me illustrate. The commercial economy is when you buy a car. There is no personal relationship between you and the car salesman, usually. Could be different, but usually. You give him the money, he hands you the keys. There is no interpersonal relationship. It's all about money. Similarly, if you go into a restaurant, you're served a meal for which you pay, which is a very basic economic concept. Sharing economies work a little bit different. We have friends, we spend time with them, we could give them a car, we could lend them a car, we invite them to have dinner. They do not pay us for it, we do it because we care. We call these sharing economies with the paradigm example of love. When I mention that to my students, they sometimes chuckle. I have no idea why. And then Lessig and Benkler said, now we have arrived at a hybrid economy. And they used the examples of Wikipedia, open source software, to say people come together to achieve a common aim. They do it because they care, like in the sharing economy, but the value that is behind this is different than purely financial gain. They do it because they care, but sometimes they do it for fame, sometimes they do it for additional benefits. We have developed a new economic model, they argued. We are able to develop this further, hence regulating online communities. Not because of goodwill of the people, but because of other benefits, not just money. This was complemented by the concept of Wikinomics, another book that we got really excited about in the early 2010s. David Tapscott, in his Wikinomics, argued that we have indeed built a completely new economic model. He elaborated on 4 principles, principles. It is open, anyone can join. It is based on peer-to-peer relationships. We can all work together as equals. Open source does that for you. You write a piece of code and others will verify whether it's good. It's all about sharing, and it is a global concept. When we work together across cultures, we produce better results. Great. Is this free? Well, these authors were not naive. There are no free lunches. Just the value of money has changed. It's no longer paid in currency. These could be your Instagram influencers, where the benefits come in kind in different shapes and forms. So we had this concept of a hybrid economy that would lead to global co-regulation or self-regulation. We thought we had it figured out. We were talking about the law of cyber communities. Now, as an international lawyer, I love this. This is jus gentium, the law of the nations being reborn. We've had this. That's how the Roman Empire developed arguably the most influential legal system worldwide. We can do it again. We look at the communities, we turn the principles that they have developed into law. Yes, we will have a jus internet, just like we had the jus gentium. Well, then NSA kicked in. We had the Snowden revelations. You might remember that one. Chancellor Merkel was very unhappy about the NSA eavesdropping on her communications. We had the first Schrems case, and we started talking about data, how it is being used, abused, and misused by big companies. This is where the governments got really interested in all of these political concepts. And they said, well, it's nice that you guys have all of those theories, but they clearly, as we could see from the examples, are not sufficient. So the governments looked into an efficient way to regulate cyberspace, yet again, third time one could say. What is the internet? I like us to think about it in pictures. You could say, well, it's a telecommunications network. And you would be absolutely right. There it is. Whatever you send goes in ones and zeros, bits and bytes, through a submarine cable wherever you want to reach. As simple as that. An international lawyer would say, we have regulation for undersea cables. Let's just use it. That is a good point of departure. Unfortunately, it's not that simple, because the internet also looks like this. This is a map of data flows. How we communicate in cyberspace is transboundary. When you want to connect to the US, you do not necessarily have to use one route. That would be the shortest one through the submarine cable. You will go through different providers as based on the internet protocol. So if I was to show a picture of cyberspace, it would probably look more like this than the previous one. But my favorite one is the internet governance lasagna. This is something I referenced in my question previously. We have taken a deep dive into the content layer. But please let me note, for the purpose of this discussion, this is just the most outer layer of the internet. The data, the disinformation, the cat pictures. This is all on the outside of codes and infrastructures. The lasagna, depending on whom you ask, may have more layers, but this is the simplest of pictures. We depend on those submarine cables. That is the layer of infrastructure, the hardware layer. For those devices to connect, we need the software layer. We need the protocols. And that's where the DNS abuse discussion I had mentioned previously comes in. With telecom infrastructures, it's private companies who own it. Who makes the protocols and the standards? Is this governed by governments? Is this regulated by law? Well, some of you probably know the answer, but I just might shock some of our younger guests here today. They do not. This is self-regulated in a multi-stakeholder process. It's engineers and volunteers who develop standards that operate on a rough consensus and running code. This includes, for example, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. They are supposed to stick to the technical operation of the network. This includes taking down botnets. If we see a botnet, we take it down. Well, yeah, great, that's technical operation. If we see child pornography, we will take it down. Good that you do that, but child pornography is not really technical operation, it's content. If we see intellectual property violations, we will take it down. Now, this is where we say, hold up, this is content regulation. This is something we've been discussing for 2 days. The operators, the technical standard development communities, shy away from admitting that they actually do regulate content. They say, no, 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 that's a different layer. That's where the law comes in. That's where the governments regulate. And this is the layer we have been discussing throughout these 2 days. Well, you might want to consider looking into the protocol layer if you want to make sure that these discussions do have a real-life effect. But I'm not going to dive into this. I want to draw a broader picture. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm just going to move on. Who governs this entire, again, I'm going to use the food reference, we are after lunch, this lasagna. We call this the multi-stakeholder model of governance. 3 groups of actors acting in their respective roles, working together, identifying and implementing standards for the day-to-day operation of the internet. There is a well-established definition of internet governance. These 3 groups are governments, working together with business, working together with civil society. That's you and I. Civil society is internet end users. You get to have a say about how these standards work. If you want to get involved, reach out after the conference. I'll tell you how to do that. This is just to highlight that the paradigm we have for lawmaking, again, is ill-suited to regulate the layers of cyberspace. I promised you solutions. Let's try to look into these. International law is built on international principles. Why don't we just take them and apply them to this global network for all to enjoy the benefits thereof? Sure, this is the discussion that is going on right now among and between states. We seem to agree that international law applies in cyberspace. I don't want to go back to the question on sources of international law, but we also universally seem to agree that the Charter of the United Nations holds the basic principles. This is where we come back to the principles. Let's have a very brief peek. There is a report from the International Law Commission on principles of international law. Okay, so we just take that and we apply it to regulating whatever issue we have online. Simple enough. If I was to give you a list of principles of international law, I would have to say that A, it's inconclusive, it's an open catalog, as we like to say here in Central Europe, and B, it is disputed. I am here among like-minded countries. We agree that international law applies. But let me just highlight, that is not universal. Our Chinese friends were not at the table when this document was being developed. They find it really challenging to say, well, yes, sure, we agree, all of these are true. If I was to pick one of the principles, and again, these are just examples, most relevant ones, that is approved by most states, I would say it's sovereignty. We all agree states enjoy sovereignty. I have here other principles that underlie current discussions, like the equality of state, non-intervention, no harm. I will leave this outside of this current presentation. Let's look at sovereignty. International lawyers love the Westphalian concept of sovereignty. That's something we developed here, not far from here, to be quite honest, in Europe. And sovereignty, in essence, was established as the equality of states. If you're a sovereign state, you have the right to decide what you want to do and what you don't want to do. With sovereignty comes a bunch of benefits. You can decide on war and peace, engage in diplomatic relations, economic relations, etc., etc. In Europe, we have evolved to shared autonomy, to co-regulation, to shared sovereignty. We, as states, have decided to renounce parts of our autonomy to work better, to work together more efficiently. The Chinese seem to be stuck at the Westphalian concept of sovereignty. But okay, let's use this example as a common denominator. If we look at state sovereignty as the most fundamental principle, what do we get? Well, we get at least 3 answers. Here in Europe, we say that state sovereignty is built on protecting people. I'm going to insist in the 9 minutes that I have left that this is the message we need to carry to the world. Indeed, we have an idea, we have built a system putting the individual in the middle. And these discussions we've been having throughout these 2 days are a proof to that point, and I welcome the intervention from Bernat on GDPR. Thank you, that is an element of this complex system that we have here. We have built EU law on human rights. This is unique. This is export material, if only we can sell it. But let's be fair. The concept of sovereignty is most popular in China. China argues they are sovereign online. They can do as they please. And their concept of regulation, lawmaking is very different. We are a big country, they say. We need to keep everyone safe. And we can do it only if we control everything. They might be right. And then we talked a little bit about the United States, the all-ruling hand of the market. I loved Uta saying yesterday that there is this settler mentality where you're distrustful and you have to fend for yourself. It's justified by the history, but it's just very different. So even if we agree that the underlying framework is sovereignty, the basic principle, indeed, we have a different look at what it actually means. I'm going to argue that this European approach is worthy of presentation to the world. Where do we carry this message? Where is this discussion going on? Where do we take the European way of regulating platforms to make it stick with others? Now, this is the difficult question. I don't have a simple answer. You might think it's the UN, but you would be wrong. On the following slide, I will show you where this process is happening at the UN right now. I would just say, get involved wherever you can. The work that I do in my free time is within ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, the folks that actually develop the standards. Frustrating, but fascinating, to be honest with you. Governments do the very same work within the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. Again, spoiler alert, there is a new IP proposal from our Chinese friends. They want to have their own internet. They want to have a new IP system. Not going to bite now, but who knows? And it's coming from Huawei, as you might imagine. This might be the way of the future. We have the IGF. Again, I'm going to advertise it. The IGF is coming to Katowice in Poland this year. If you have a week free, early December, consider coming over. It is a hybrid meeting. You can participate online. This is the Internet Governance Forum. This is where the civil society meets and discusses topics of relevance to Internet governance. No binding power, but this is where we can hammer out the compromise. The IETF, a standard-setting organization, the Internet Engineering Task Force, the first meeting, 1986, 21 US engineers, now thousands of volunteers thick. They developed the technical standard, not policies like ICANN, the very technical standards. And finally, this discussion on international law and cyberspace has been captured by NATO. States have viewed cyberspace as the fifth domain, as a potential threat. human rights come at the very end. The UN right now has two parallel tracks. One is the group of governmental experts led by like-minded countries, like those in Europe, like the ones you and I live in. But because the human rights-based proposal that the EU has to offer to the world could not be accepted by Russia or China, they initiated a parallel track within the UN, the open-ended working group. It is indeed open. You can join, you can listen in. These are meeting late November in New York as well. So this is a process that is happening before our eyes. Please kindly note, these discussions are happening in the disarmament context. Disarmament. Disinformation and fake news drags on the tailwinds of these discourses. That is content regulation approach from the rear side, so to speak. I'm going to stop here. This was just to highlight that we do have a framework that could be facilitated with European experiences we've been discussing throughout the 2 days. I think we have a good narrative. I love the cauliflower. I think it's export ready. We can just carry that message to the world, putting the individual in the middle. This is unique. No one has this. In terms of capacity building, in terms of, excuse the word, cybersecurity strategies. We offer a unique model that puts human rights, fundamental rights, at the core of that discussion. No one else can offer that to developing countries. Africa, South America, they are the next billion to join the internet. If we can make our voices heard, it's a sad deal. I will wait for the questions. Thank you very much.